Clark injury away from this league, going back to pre-2024, not 2023, but everything lower in 2024. Like, we all know this league is nowhere near as culturally relevant right now as it was in.
Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. This league is one Caitlyn Clark injury away from sliding straight back to where it was before 2024, not 2023, not a down year. I'm talking about the version of the WNBA that struggled for relevance, attention, and cultural weight. And that's not hate, it's not exaggeration. It's the reality quietly shaping every decision being made behind closed doors right now. 6 months ago, this league felt unstoppable. Sold out arenas, ratings spikes, jerseys outselling some of the biggest names in men's sports.
The league knows it's a problem, but the players, and this is where the kind of lack of professionalism on the player side comes in. Like, they're like reposting stuff about striking. They basically said here, at midnight it expires. Despite demonstrating our willingness to compromise in order to get the deal done, they've shown no willingness. From what we've seen, the players have said, this is what we want.
For the first time ever, women's basketball wasn't asking for attention, it was commanding it. Now look around. Mainstream shows aren't talking about it. Historic performances are barely breaking through. The only stories that cut through the noise still revolve around one name, and that's the part that makes this moment dangerous. Because while fans are debating fairness, loyalty, and who deserves what, the league and the players are locked in the most high-risk negotiation in WNBA history. A game of chicken where neither side can afford to lose, but both sides are acting like they can. At the center of it all is a single question no one wants to answer honestly. Who actually holds the leverage? The players say the league needs them. The league says the current demands are unsustainable. And hovering over every conversation is the reality that the entire business model is balanced on a level of momentum that may not survive disruption. What you're about to hear isn't a hit piece. It's not anti-player or pro-owner. It's a breakdown of how fragile this moment really is, and why one wrong move could undo the most important year women's professional basketball has ever had. Because this isn't just about money. It's about whether this league is built strongly enough to survive its own success. What makes this situation so alarming isn't just where the league is now, it's how fast it got here. In 2024, the WNBA wasn't fighting for attention, it owned it. Games felt like events. Road arenas sold out weeks in advance. Social media clips crossed over into spaces women's basketball had never consistently reached before. For the first time, the league wasn't being framed as growing. It was being treated as arrived. And then it stopped. Not slowly, not over years, in a matter of months. By early 2025, the mainstream conversation had shifted away. Major sports shows weren't leading with women's basketball anymore. Historic performances barely cracked the algorithm. Even when stars like Paige Bucas put up jaw-dropping numbers, the moment came and went without sticking. That's the part people don't want to confront. This wasn't backlash, it wasn't rejection, it was indifference, and indifference is far more dangerous. The only WNBA stories that consistently broke through in January weren't about the league as a whole. They were about Caitlyn Clark, her first unrivaled appearance, rumors about where she might land next, speculation about her role in the league's future. Everything else struggled to gain oxygen. That tells you something critical. The 2024 boom wasn't evenly distributed momentum. It was concentrated. The league benefited from it, but it didn't fully convert it into long-term, independent relevance. When the spotlight shifted even slightly, the ecosystem underneath it didn't hold the same weight on its own. This is where the timing becomes terrifying. Instead of building on that momentum quietly, the league entered 2025 with uncertainty. No unified narrative, no consistent media presence, and now, on top of that, a labor standoff that threatens to interrupt the product entirely. Casual fans don't wait through uncertainty, they drift, and once they drift, they don't always come back. That's why this moment feels different from past labor disputes. The WNBA isn't negotiating from a position of surplus attention. It's negotiating while momentum is already leaking out. And that sets the stage for the pressure cooker we're about to get into. Because when attention is fragile, leverage becomes everything, and both sides are about to test just how much of it they actually have. The timing couldn't have been worse. At midnight on January 31st, the collective bargaining agreement officially expired. No extension, no quiet bridge deal, just a hard stop and a power vacuum between the WNBA and the WNBA Players Association. That's when things stopped being theoretical. Publicly, the players framed it as standing their ground, statements about being undervalued, posts hinting at labor action, symbolic protests meant to signal seriousness. The message was clear: this league doesn't exist without us. Privately, the league responded with one word that explains everything: unsustainable. That word isn't an insult, it's a warning. The WNBA doesn't operate like other major leagues. Most teams are independently owned. Operating costs vary wildly by market. Some franchises lose money every year and survive only because ownership groups are willing to absorb the losses. That reality shapes every negotiation, whether fans like it or not. The Players Association is pushing for a revenue-sharing model tied to a percentage of gross league revenue. On paper, it sounds fair. If the league grows, player pay grows. If it shrinks, pay adjusts. But here's the problem: the league itself doesn't control enough centralized revenue to guarantee that structure. This isn't the NBA. There isn't a massive national TV deal carrying everyone. There isn't equal financial footing across teams. When the league hears revenue sharing, what they hear is risk they can't legally or structurally support. That's why the league's counteroffer looks boring but stable: a fixed salary cap with guaranteed annual increases. Predictable, contained, survivable. From the player's perspective, that feels like settling. From the league's perspective, it's the only model that doesn't collapse under its own weight. And this is where the standoff gets dangerous. The players believe public pressure helps them. The league believes silence helps them. Neither side wants to blink first because blinking looks like weakness. But unlike past negotiations, there's no cushion here. Momentum isn't growing in the background, it's fading. That's the part that changes everything. Negotiations usually happen when leagues are stable or growing. This one is happening while the sport's relevance is visibly tied to one variable: health, availability, and attention around Caitlyn Clark. So when both sides harden their positions, they aren't just negotiating salaries. They're gambling with timing. And in a league this fragile, timing isn't a detail, it's the entire equation. At the center of this standoff is a gap that sounds smaller than it actually is. The WNBA Players Association isn't just asking for higher salaries, they're asking for a different system altogether. Specifically, a revenue-sharing model tied to roughly 30% of gross league revenue. Not a cap that rises predictably, not fixed raises. A fluctuating structure that moves up or down based on how the league performs each year. From the player's perspective, the logic feels airtight. Attendance surged in 2024, ratings jumped, merchandise exploded. Why shouldn't the people on the court share directly in that growth? The problem is what happens when you zoom out. The WNBA doesn't function like leagues most fans are used to comparing it with. It isn't centrally controlled in the same way as the NBA. Teams don't operate on equal footing. Some franchises have deep-pocketed owners willing to eat losses. Others are barely breaking even. A few rely heavily on local sponsorships just to stay afloat. That uneven structure makes revenue sharing far riskier than it sounds. When players hear revenue, they're thinking league-wide growth. When the league hears it, they're thinking about worst-case scenarios. What happens in a down year? What happens if a major TV partner renegotiates? What happens if attendance dips back to pre-2024 levels? Under a fluctuating model, all of that risk gets passed directly into payroll. That's why the league's counteroffer looks conservative, a fixed salary cap with guaranteed annual increases, reportedly around 5%. It's not flashy, it doesn't feel revolutionary, but it's predictable, and predictability is how fragile businesses survive. This is where the messaging starts to drift into dangerous territory. When players use phrases like pay equity, it resonates emotionally and publicly. But behind closed doors, the league hears something else, a financial structure that their current model literally cannot support. Not won't, cannot. And that disconnect is fueling the tension. The players believe the league is undervaluing them. The league believes the players are demanding a system built for a version of the WNBA that doesn't exist yet. Both sides are arguing from what they think the league should be, not what it actually is. That's why compromise has stalled. Because this isn't just a disagreement over percentages, it's a disagreement over reality. One side is negotiating based on momentum, the other is negotiating based on survivability. And when those two things collide, something usually breaks. The question is whether it breaks quietly at the table or publicly, once games start disappearing. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, and where most of the public discussion completely falls apart. The players are negotiating as if leverage is evenly distributed across the league, as if every roster spot carries the same weight, as if losing any group of players would hurt the business equally. That simply isn't true. From a cold business standpoint, there are maybe 6 or 7 players in the entire WNBA whose individual brand is bigger than the team they play for. That's not a comment on talent, it's a comment on market reality. Most fans don't tune in for specific names. They tune in for the team in their city, the experience, and the league itself. Think about how fragile individual star power actually is outside the top tier. If a mid-market team replaced its entire roster tomorrow with comparable players, attendance wouldn't collapse, viewership wouldn't crater, the logo on the jersey would still matter more than the names on the back. That's true across most professional leagues, but it's especially true here. This is where the league quietly holds more cards than it appears. The league doesn't need every player to keep operating, it needs continuity, it needs a season to exist, it needs a handful of stars healthy and visible. Everything else, from a business perspective, is replaceable. That's harsh, it's uncomfortable, but it's how owners and broadcasters think. The players, meanwhile, are acting as if withholding labor automatically shifts power in their favor. That assumption only works if the league cannot function without them. And in this case, the league knows something the players don't want to fully acknowledge. There are alternatives. If a strike happens, the league doesn't instantly disappear. It scales back, it restructures, it waits. Replacement scenarios get discussed quietly, developmental pipelines suddenly matter more. The brand survives, diminished, yes, but intact. For the players, the math is different. This league isn't a side project. It's their primary source of income. Their career window is short. Missing a season doesn't just delay earnings, it permanently erases them. You don't get those years back. That's why this standoff feels lopsided beneath the surface. The league is negotiating from a position of long-term endurance. The players are negotiating from a position of urgency, and urgency is rarely leverage when the other side can afford to wait. None of this means the players are wrong to ask for more. They created real value in 2024. They deserve to share in it. But leverage isn't about what's fair. It's about who can survive the fallout. And once you see the imbalance clearly, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. What happens if this turns from talk into missed games? This is the scenario nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone in the room is quietly calculating. If Caitlyn Clark goes down for an extended stretch, the league's entire financial forecast changes overnight. Not hypothetically, not emotionally, mathematically. Ratings projections collapse. Attendance expectations reset. Media partners start revisiting assumptions they made just months earlier. And suddenly, the version of the WNBA that looked like it was finally breaking through starts to look fragile again. This isn't about blame, it's about dependency. In 2024, the league's growth wasn't evenly distributed across markets or players. It was concentrated. Clark's games drove spikes. Her appearances shifted coverage. Her presence turned ordinary matchups into events. When she wasn't on the floor, the numbers told a very different story. That pattern didn't go unnoticed by executives, broadcasters, or sponsors. Now layer that reality onto a labor standoff. If Clark was sidelined while negotiations dragged on, the league wouldn't just lose momentum, it would lose leverage. The new television money everyone is counting on becomes uncertain. Sponsors start asking tougher questions. Make goods enter the conversation. Contracts get revisited. Future guarantees shrink. And here's the part most fans don't realize. Under the revenue-sharing model players are pushing for, an injury doesn't just hurt owners, it hurts payroll. If revenue dips, the cap dips. If the cap dips far enough, the system the players are demanding actively works against them. A model designed to reward growth becomes a trap in a downturn. That's why the league views this risk as existential. They aren't just protecting margins, they're protecting continuity. Because once revenue projections get revised downward, it's incredibly hard to claw them back up. Broadcasters don't rush to re-up at higher numbers after uncertainty. Sponsors don't overpay for instability. Casual fans don't return just because things feel better again. The league office understands this. Ownership understands this. And deep down, the players understand it too, even if it's uncomfortable to admit. That's why this moment feels so tense. Both sides are negotiating as if the window will stay open, as if time is neutral, as if nothing unexpected can happen, but sports don't work that way. One awkward landing, one non-contact moment, one bad break, and the entire balance shifts. This isn't fear-mongering, it's risk management. And when a league's future hinges so heavily on one variable staying intact, every delay becomes more dangerous than it looks. Which brings us to the point of no return. Because if this standoff turns into missed games, the injury scenario stops being theoretical, and the fallout becomes impossible to contain. On paper, a strike sounds like leverage. No games, no product, no revenue. The assumption is simple: pressure the league hard enough and they'll cave. That logic works in leagues where demand is locked in and alternatives don't exist. The problem is the WNBA isn't operating in that kind of ecosystem yet. If games start getting missed, the damage doesn't distribute evenly. The first thing that happens isn't owners panicking, it's sponsors pulling back. Brands don't attach themselves to uncertainty. If there's no guarantee of inventory, campaigns get paused or quietly reallocated. That money doesn't come back automatically once play resumes. Next come the broadcasters. TV partners didn't sign deals for statements, protests, or negotiations. They signed for games. If those games don't happen, contracts get reopened. Ratings, projections get revised downward. And once that reset happens, it sticks. Media partners don't pay future premiums for leagues that just proved they can't deliver consistently. Then there's the audience. Hardcore fans might follow the dispute. Casual fans won't. They'll watch something else. And unlike diehards, they don't feel a sense of loyalty strong enough to wait months for a resolution. They drift, and drifting attention is almost impossible to recover. This is where the players' leverage starts evaporating. Owners can afford downtime. Most of them are billionaires with diversified portfolios. Losing money on the WNBA hurts, but it doesn't threaten their lifestyle. For players, it's different. This is the career. The earning window is short. Missing even one season doesn't just delay income, it permanently erases it. For an average player, that's not abstract. It's tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars that never come back. Miss a season, and you lose a percentage of your lifetime basketball earnings. Miss a season and trigger long-term instability, and you risk losing the league entirely. And here's the harsh reality. The league can survive in a diminished form, scale back, rebuild slowly, lean on brand identity. The players don't have that luxury. There's no safety net league waiting to absorb hundreds of displaced athletes at comparable pay. That's why this isn't a traditional labor fight. A strike doesn't force urgency on the side that can wait. It creates urgency for the side that can't. And right now, the players are betting that public sympathy will carry them through that gap. That's a dangerous bet. Because once games are missed, the narrative shifts. This stops being a story about growth and fairness and becomes a story about instability and risk. And that narrative, once it takes hold, doesn't disappear when a deal is finally signed. It lingers. Which is why the next step, actually canceling games, isn't just a negotiating tactic. It's a line you don't get to cross twice. If this crosses from tension into missed games, the fallout doesn't stop at the schedule. It spreads. The first domino isn't the league folding overnight. That's a misconception. Collapse doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly, piece by piece. It starts with uncertainty becoming policy. Once games are cancelled, sponsors don't just pause spending. They reassess the entire relationship. Deals built on momentum suddenly feel risky. Marketing departments don't wait for clarity. They move budgets elsewhere. And when sponsors leave, they don't rush back just because a deal gets signed later. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. Then comes television. Broadcast partners don't care about who's right or wrong. They care about reliability. Missed games mean reduced inventory, which means renegotiation. That shiny future media deal everyone is counting on to justify higher salaries. It doesn't survive a season where the league proves it can't deliver. Rights fees go down, not up. And once they're revised downward, that becomes the new baseline for years. Next, the pressure shifts to the weakest points in the system. Smaller market teams that were already operating at a loss start making hard decisions. Some pause operations, others look for exit ramps. A few disappear quietly. The league doesn't announce contraction, it just stops expanding, then starts shrinking. At the same time, the alternative paths players assume will save them don't materialize. Breakaway leagues sound powerful in theory, but they collapse under logistics. You need venues, insurance, staffing, broadcasting, sponsorship, and sustained viewership. Most experiments fail not because of talent, but because infrastructure costs eat them alive. Interest doesn't automatically turn into profitability. That's the trap. Players believe missing games creates leverage. In reality, it accelerates fragmentation. Instead of one league negotiating from strength, you get multiple weakened options competing for scraps of attention. No central narrative, no unified product, no long-term stability. And here's the most uncomfortable part. Fans don't revolt the way people expect. They don't organize mass protests demanding resolution. Most simply move on. They don't feel betrayed, they feel inconvenienced. And once new habits form, even temporarily, they don't snap back easily. This is how relevance dies, not with outrage, but with replacement. The league knows this. That's why they're cautious. Not because they're heartless or greedy, but because they've seen this movie before in other leagues, other sports, other markets. Momentum is fragile. Once it breaks, it doesn't magically return because intentions were good. That's why this moment feels so dangerous. It's not just about salaries or percentages. It's about whether the WNBA emerges from this as a stronger institution or fractures into something that never fully recovers. And once the chain reaction starts, there's no rewind button. That's the real risk everyone is circling, even if they refuse to say it out loud. This is the part where most people want to pick a side: players versus owners, labor versus management, fairness versus greed. But that framing misses what actually makes this moment so dangerous. There are no clean winners here. The players are right about one thing that shouldn't be debated. They created real value in 2024. Attendance jumped, ratings climbed, merchandise exploded. For a brief window, the WNBA felt culturally unavoidable. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the product on the court finally captured attention at scale. The players earned a bigger piece of that. But being right doesn't automatically mean having leverage. The league is also right about something uncomfortable. Its financial structure is still fragile. Most teams don't print money. Some survive only because ownership groups are willing to absorb losses. That reality doesn't disappear just because momentum finally showed up. If anything, it makes mistakes more costly. That's why this negotiation feels so tense. Both sides are arguing from truths that don't fully overlap. The players are negotiating as if 2024 permanently changed the league's foundation. The league is negotiating as if 2024 was a peak that still needs to be proven sustainable. Neither position is crazy, but when both sides harden instead of adjust, the risk multiplies. Hovering over everything is the reality nobody wants to build policy around. How dependent the current moment is on Caitlyn Clark, staying healthy, visible, and central to the conversation. That dependency doesn't invalidate the league, but it does shrink the margin for error. You don't negotiate recklessly when your momentum is narrow. This is where the choice becomes unavoidable. The players can push until the last possible second, extract incremental gains, and hope the season survives intact. Or they can overplay their hand, miss games, and trigger consequences they can't reverse. The league can protect stability at the risk of alienating labor, or it can stretch beyond its limits and gamble on growth that may not hold. None of those paths are clean. What makes this moment frustrating is that the most logical compromise exists, but it's emotionally unsatisfying. Guaranteed raises, predictable growth, another negotiation in a few years when the data is clearer. That's not revolutionary. It doesn't feel like justice, but it might be survivable. Because once games are missed, once trust erodes, once the narrative shifts from rising league to unstable product, there's no press release that fixes it, no statement that rewinds it. Momentum doesn't care who was right. This isn't about who deserves more. It's about who can afford to lose and who can't. That's the choice sitting on the table right now. And the clock doesn't stop just because everyone is convinced they're standing on principle.